Good evening, everyone. I'm Vasily Kolyatsos, Chairman of the Board of the Society for the Preservation of Greek Heritage, and I would like to welcome you all tonight to this very special and different event. It is special because it combines a number of themes that we've dealt with in our nearly 50 years of existence as society, but also because it is reflective, I could say symbolic, of one of the main features of Hellenism, which is its openness to the world. In tonight's case, the openness of the cradle of Hellenism, that is Greece. This open spirit is certainly about cultural exchanges and amalgamations, but also about movements of people and populations. And all this regardless whether Greece was in the form of city-states or under the dominion of one or the other of these city-states, or was part of an alliance or an empire, such as the Eastern Roman Empire, or as an independent modern Greek state after the Second Protocol of London. A lot of this back and forth with the world was not pour passer le temps, but a conscious process of interest and curiosity, or an act of love, especially for some fascinating individuals, many of them intellectuals, who came from the West and in one way or another made Greece their home. And in so doing, they did not only reconstruct, at least for the West, an image of diachronic Greece that had been broken by eons of subjugation or isolation, but also contributed to the formation of the identity of Greece, at least as a modern Western nation. And this is what our distinguished speaker is going to delve into for all of you tonight. I will now pass the baton to Kostis Toregas, member of the board of the Society, who will introduce our speaker and will conduct the various parts of this extraordinary event. I wish you all a very enjoyable evening.
Thank you, Vasily, and I hope you stay around for the discussion. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce you to someone who rapidly became a friend over one dinner. We were looking almost conceptually at the waters right behind me, over the beautiful island of Paros, with my good friend Efrosini and good wife Chadley. And Bruce was kind enough to share with us some spectacular thoughts about how he sees through his own eyes what is Greece. And I kind of reached out to him a month later saying, would you share that with more than just a table full of friends? And he kindly agreed. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to Bruce and then allow him to set the stage for what is to come. Bruce Clark worked as an international news journalist for more than 40 years. He's been to Paris, to Athens, to Moscow, to Washington, doing the good work of a journalist. He was born in Northern Ireland in 1958 and educated at Cambridge. And he's always had a strong interest in the ancient and modern history of Greece. He made several reporting trips to Greece for the Financial Times and The Economist, very active in the environmental initiatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And in September 22, he was awarded the Golden Cross of the Order of Phoenix for services to Greek culture and history. And more than that, he has written spectacular books. The two that I want to reference is Twice a Stranger, which is an account of the population exchange, and how it kind of came to be, and it's a heart-rending story. And also, more recently, he published Athens, City of Wisdom, which brought us together on that dinner table, a spectacular history of Athens. So with that, Bruce, I'm absolutely delighted that you can share some of these ideas with our friends here on the SPGH channel, as it were. I'm going to ask you to perhaps make some introductory remarks and then share somewhat of a lecture that you've prepared for us, and then be back for an extended discussion. So with that, I'm going to send it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kostis. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I'm actually in Belfast tonight. You're mostly in the States, I suppose, but our hearts are in Greece. And so I'll begin by speaking a little bit personally about my own introduction to Greece. I first was brought to Greece by my parents who lived in Northern Ireland on a family holiday when I was 11 years old. And I had the experience of visiting the then newly built villa of Patrick Leigh Fermor and his wife Joan, literally a year or so after that spectacular house was built. And that made a very strong impression on 11-year-old me, I must say. I didn't really understand at that time what a great writer and war hero he was, but I could see that this was a very fascinating world that I longed to know more of. Then returning to Greece as a journalist in my 20s, I was the first expatriate correspondent which Reuters news agency sent to Athens. And I spent 4 very formative years in my 20s in Athens. And one of the things I remember is that it was still the case then, we're talking about the early 80s, it was still the case then that quite a lot of the older members of, shall we say, the Greek middle class and intelligentsia spoke French and German, but not necessarily English. And that reflected the fact that in the 20s, the early 30s, the Greek intelligentsia was very much oriented to Paris and Berlin and maybe places like Heidelberg and Tübingen as places to study, and to French and German as the first foreign languages they learned. And it even happened to me that I had to communicate with some of my Greek acquaintances before my Greek became fluent in French. So I caught the tail end, if you like, of that era when the Greek intelligentsia was more Francophone than Anglophone. And if you look at the first 30 years or so of the 20th century, really significant contacts between English speakers and the Greeks in the cultural realm certainly exist, but they exist as kind of isolated vignettes and phenomena. Of course, one very important thing to mention is the meeting between Cavafy, the poet, and the English novelist E.M. Forster in Alexandria in 1916, which led to Cavafy's being recognized and translated in the English-speaking world, and in due course becoming known as probably the best known of all modern Greek poets. So that Cavafy-Forster encounter is certainly one example of an important vignette. And one would also mention as a culturally significant moment, the arrival in Greece of Eva Palmer, the American lady who was a great expert already when she arrived in the ancient Greek theater, music, chant, and her marriage to the poet Sikelianos, which led to the foundation of the Delphi Festival in 1927, and a whole new refraction of ancient Greek traditions and theater being performed in Greece. So that was also a very important moment. But it doesn't change the fact that until about 1930, the intelligentsia was not Anglophone, it was more Francophone, Germanophone. So that's by way of introductory remarks. Another sort of rather personal reminiscence is that coming to Greece in the 1980s as a foreign correspondent, of course, I met a lot of expatriates, a lot of British and American expatriates. And over time, I began to see that they divided broadly into 2 categories, into those who still regarded themselves as Britons or Americans abroad in some exotic place, who hoped ultimately in their final years to return to their homelands. And there were those who had made a profound commitment to Greece and expected indeed to die in Greece. And I was exposed, as in my 20s to one very distinguished example of the latter, who was Philip Sherard, translator, man of letters, theologian, who had settled in the countryside in Evia and become Greek Orthodox himself, and had made a profound commitment to the way of life of Greece. And that, of course, made a deep impression on me in a rather different way from the Leigh Fermor experience had. So that's just a little bit about me and what I experienced as a young man. And it does segue, I hope, into the video, which will now be shown.
So let's ask the question, when did the literary worlds of Greece
and the Anglosphere really start to be connected? Well, one possible landmark is 1931 or so, when the great Greek poet George Seferis read and admired the works of the Anglo-American man of letters T.S. Eliot. Like so many of the Greek intelligentsia, Seferis had studied in France, and he was deeply immersed in French poetry, especially the symbolist poets like Paul Valéry. But through the 1930s, he came to admire and correspond with T.S. Eliot. And he looked for ways to transfer into a Greek context the device by which Eliot had managed to fuse ancient history and mythology with present-day reality. In Eliot's case, this meant, for example, fusing stories of Phoenician sailors with everyday chatter from the streets of London. And in the Greek case, as Seferis demonstrated, it involved fusing the stories of Odysseus and his travails with tales of much more recent voyages on the same waters by refugees who were fleeing the flames of Smyrna. Another landmark came with the arrival in Corfu in 1935 of the writer Lawrence Durrell. He was a peripatetic product of the British colonial class, one of those who found England unbearably cold and dull at times, and longed for a place where he could simply live right and enjoy life in the sun without spending too much money. As he put it very plainly to an interviewer in 1975, a publisher would give you an advance in those days of £100, and that was enough to live for about 6 months in Corfu, as long as you were prepared to consume only local products and live economically, for example, by boiling your water with charcoal. Durrell's purpose in coming to Greece may have been utilitarian, but he was soon entranced by the Greek light and landscape and its mythological associations, and he found beautiful words to describe all that. But the number of Greek people with whom he interacted meaningfully was quite limited. His most important connections were elsewhere, including his publisher in London, who happened to be T.S. Eliot. And after 1937, when Durrell sent his first fan letter to Paris, those significant connections included Henry Miller. Henry Miller was an American who had grown up in New York to German Lutheran parents, and his companion Anaïs Nin was born in France to Cuban parents. But in fact, it hardly mattered where they lived or where their origins were, because they and Durrell were people who were creating a world of their own. They were creating a kind of private universe in which they were free from convention, free from literary convention, and free from old-fashioned morals as they governed sex and family arrangements. In 1937, Durrell and his wife Nancy went to Paris to stay with Henry Miller, and they actually lived in the same apartment building in Paris for a while. As the biography of Durrell records, the written records of that visit include a surreal note from Durrell to his host, in which he asks a very domestic question and a question in the realms of high theology. Dear Miller, 2 questions. 1, what do you do with the garbage? And 2, when you say to be with God, do you identify yourself with God, or do you regard this as something extraneous towards which we yearn? To which Henry replied, my dear Durrell, the first question is easier to answer than the second. The garbage you put in a little can under the sink, and about sundown or thereafter, you deposit it in front of your door in the street. As for the second question, being rather pressed for time and slightly jocund at the moment, I should say, sometimes you approach and sometimes you become. In summer 1939, Miller returned the visit. He stayed first in Corfu, and then he joined Durrell in Athens. By this time, Durrell had got a job disseminating British propaganda. Durrell immediately introduced Miller to his Greek friends. They included the poet Seferis and also the extraordinary, larger-than-life, polymath, polyglot, loquacious figure of George Katsimbelis, a man who had been very badly wounded and traumatized in World War I, but somehow exuded irrepressible optimism and zest for life. Both these Georges served as guides to Miller in his discovery of Greece's landscape and history. The two Georges and Miller visited the Greek painter Nikos Gikas in his family mansion in Hydra. Katsimbelis also escorted Miller around the archaeological sites of the Peloponnese. The American writer's return gift, if it can be so called, was to immortalize Katsimbelis in a book, The Colossus of Marousi, which is often rated as Miller's greatest work. As well as lauding the personality of Katsimbelis, Miller lays out his conviction that the archaeological sites of Greece, not just Delphi, but also Mycenae and the Minoan sites of Crete, are somehow nodal points in human development, literally navels of the earth. As Miller would write, "I am a native of New York, the grandest and emptiest city in the world. I am standing now at Mycenae, trying to understand what happened here over a period of centuries. I feel like a cockroach crawling about amidst dismantled splendors. Are we going the same way?" And then, over Christmas 1939, Miller and Lawrence Durrell and Durrell's wife Nancy made a final and rather melancholy tour of the Peloponnese. That was before Miller departed for New York. When the American parted ways with his British friends, his eyes were said to be blurred with tears and rain. The very fact that the Colossus was penned in New York through a haze of nostalgia for Greece certainly will have added to the intensity of its writing. Fast forward about 6 years, and we find the same pair of sophisticated and hospitable Greeks, namely George Seferis and George Katsimbelis, acting as mentors and guides to another generation of eager-to-learn British visitors. In the intervening period, of course, the planet in general, and Greece in particular, has been turned upside down by the most brutal conflict in human history. Starting in December 1944, the first round of the Cold War had played out on the streets of Athens, with British forces deeply involved. Yes, the world might have been turned upside down, but in some ways an old pattern of life was resuming. The same tavernas in the Plaka, the same witty and learned conversations between polyglot Greeks and Brits who were desperate to find out more about Greece and the Hellenic heritage. But in their post-war form, this Anglo-Greek intellectual banter in tavernas like Psaras and Platanos, both of which still stand, by the way, was probably even more consequential for the cultural history of both countries. The aftermath of the Second World War was a time of enormous British influence over Greece, both cultural and geopolitical. That British cultural heft continued even after spring 1947, when a cash-strapped Labour government handed over to Washington the main responsibility for supporting the Greek government and helping it to ward off the communist challenge. This cultural influence was transmitted through the British Council, through its offshoot, the British Institute, through an intensive program of English language teaching and also through the involvement of some of Britain's leading scholars and writers. Easily the most colourful, albeit short-lived participant in this Anglo-Greek scene was a dashing and rambunctious ex-soldier called Patrick Leigh Fermor. He was already a legend because he had pulled off one of the most spectacular acts of resistance against the Nazi occupiers of Europe. That was the kidnapping in May 1944 of a German general in Crete who was escorted to the mountains and then spirited away by boat to Egypt. Durrell was also a participant in this British cultural outrage, albeit at one remove, because he was working for the British administration in Rhodes. Over the next 10 years, economic necessity would force Durrell to work as a cultural envoy for Britain in various places, including Cyprus at the height of the Eoka uprising. That was despite the fact that Durrell himself had profoundly ambivalent feelings about Britain. By comparison with Leigh Fermor, Durrell was not such a loyal servant of the crown. In any case, Leigh Fermor and Durrell were friends, and they had a number of things in common. Both had experienced truncated, unhappy childhoods, which were overshadowed by the prolonged absence of parents who were deeply connected with India. Leigh Fermor's mother spoke fluent Hindi and bequeathed her linguistic gifts to her son. Both writers inherited from their parents a sense that England was a sunless, in some ways cheerless place, but also at the same time the ultimate source of everything that mattered. But it's striking that Leigh Fermor, even in 1945, had plunged much, much deeper into the waters of Greece and Greek society than Durrell ever had or ever would. Strangely enough, his entry point to Greece was Mount Athos. He toured the Holy Mountain in early 1935 after completing his youthful walk across Europe. In contrast with the exuberant elegance of most of his writing, we can trace this young man's wanderings across the Holy Mountain through the artless diaries that he wrote at the age of 20. They were published in 2013. So what we have is the writing of an alert, intelligent 20-year-old with a keen eye for the absurd, but also with good instincts about very unfamiliar people whose religious and material culture is very different from his own. He can distinguish sincerity from hypocrisy, and that's already a very useful virtue. As his biographer Artemis Cooper accurately notes, the most formative time of his Greek existence was not the spectacular kidnapping, but rather the 15 or 16 months of clandestine existence as a British agent in the mountains of Western Crete. He was winning the trust of mountain villagers, he was learning to speak their dialects fluently, he was hearing their songs, he was hearing their long recitations of epic poetry, in particular the medieval poem, the Eratokritos, of which illiterate farmers could sometimes recite hundreds of lines. He would later describe this as a time when we lived in goat folds and abandoned conical cheesemakers' huts, and above all, in the myriad caverns that mercifully riddle the island's stiff spine. Some of these were too shallow to keep the snow out, others would house a cyclops and all his retinue. It was because of the relationships of trust built up during this clandestine period that he was able to pull off the Kruiper kidnapping, and to cope also with the personal challenges that flowed almost inevitably from deep involvement with a proud, gun-bearing population where questions of honor and feud were taken very seriously. In a tragedy which must have devastated him, he was responsible for the accidental death from a stray bullet of one of his young comrades. But such was his own personal charisma and his feeling for Cretan sensibilities that he was somehow able to repair the blood feud which this tragedy created,
although this didn't happen for many years. After these extraordinary adventures in Crete, it's not surprising that the young Lee Firma did not take easily to the role of being a junior cultural ambassador, answering to venerable British scholars who found him at times cocksure and overconfident. He was effectively sacked from his British Council job in Athens in late 1946, a decision which embittered him at the time, but also had the benign effect, arguably, of propelling him and his future wife, Joan Ayres-Monsell, out of Greece at a time when the Civil War was about to enter its bloodiest phase. For the remainder of his life, an odd set of circumstances would propel Lee Firma out of Greece and then bring him back to Greece again in a kind of recurring pattern. His first book was not about Greece, but in fact a travelogue about the Caribbean. But its success paved the way for two very important books about Greece. First, Rumeli, which is notionally focused on a journey around northern and central Greece, but in fact includes speculation about every aspect of Hellenism and its history, and also Mani, which is a historically informed journey through the stony peninsula in the Peloponnese, where he would eventually make his permanent home. Even after the appearance of those books about Greece, it was not his Hellenic interests that gained him a reputation as one of the foremost travel writers of the 20th century. Rather, it was the two volumes that he penned about his youthful wanderings across Europe as an 18-year-old, starting in 1934, a time of gifts and Between the Woods and the Water. Both works use, with immense skill and sophistication, roughly the same literary device as had been employed in his Greek travelogues. Deep and hard-won knowledge about architecture or flora and fauna, or the history of battles, cultures, art, is somehow projected backwards into the mind of a precocious young traveler who supposedly picks up this knowledge in the form of random nuggets. Only a very deft hand can pull off such a trick and make it appear seamless, and Lee Firma had the necessary deftness. Following his death at the age of 96, interest in Lee Firma and his social and literary world has moved in an unexpected direction. It has moved towards a kind of fascination with the sophisticated and elegant way of life under the Greek sun, which he and his friends supposedly enjoyed. In 2018, an exhibition, accompanied by a beautifully illustrated book, was put on at the British Museum and also at the Menaki Museum in Athens and the Levendis Museum in Cyprus. Using photographs, letters, and mementos, it documented the charmed lives in Greece, led by Paddy and Joan Lee Firma, their friend the painter Nikos Gikos, and the artist John Craxton, who lived in Chania in Crete and illustrated Paddy's books. It highlighted the Lee Firma's beautiful house in the Mani, now run by the Benaki Museum, and also the spectacular homes in Hydra and Corfu, where they and Craxton were entertained by Gikos. Interest in this Anglo-Greek Camelot was further fanned when an excellent biography of Craxton, written by Ian Collins, won the Runciman Prize for writing about Greece last year. If I were tracing the relationship between creative Anglophones and Greece, I think I would prefer to focus on a similar but slightly different triangle. I would certainly include Lee Firma and Craxton in my triangle, not least because Craxton's illustrations were such an important part of the writer's creative output. But I would also want to include the impulsive, quixotic figure of Kevin Andrews, who was born to American parents in China, went to an English public school, but in fact renounced all those countries and embraced Greece instead as his real homeland. Andrews made a deeper commitment to Greece than almost any of the Anglophone writers who were in his circle. For example, he was an active opponent of the dictators who took power in 1967, and he was injured in the Polytechnic uprising. After those events, he renounced his American citizenship and was grateful to be offered Greek citizenship by the restored democratic government of Athens. There was nothing at all charmed about his life. He arrived at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens in 1947 and then managed to prolong his stay in Greece by getting another scholarship to study the castles and forts of the Peloponnese. As a result, he spent the summers between 1948 and 1951 touring a landscape which was traumatized by occupation, poverty, and internal strife. He was talking in his increasingly fluent Greek to people on both sides of that internal conflict. He was melding his own sense of dislocation and personal and financial uncertainty with that of the nation that he was documenting. The writing that emerged from those peregrinations, Flight of Icaros in particular, has been recognized as some of the best prose ever penned in English about Greece. There is a sincere and authentic vulnerability in Andrews' tone, which somehow strikes a deep chord. It is the voice of an insecure, but also highly intelligent and deeply empathetic young man, a man who is traveling around a country where the wounds of war are still gaping and bleeding. Whatever their differences, Lee Farmer, Craxton, and Andrews had certain things in common. All three came from relatively privileged Anglophone backgrounds. All three benefited from the patronage, encouragement, and almost maternal interest of certain well-connected British ladies, including, for example, Lady Norton, wife of the British ambassador Sir Clifford Norton. Lady Norton's nickname was Peter Norton. It was Peter Norton who spotted Craxton as a promising young artist and brought him to Greece. Lady Norton also took a motherly kind of interest in Andrews, even though they quarreled about politics. Indeed, there was an enormous difference between the attitudes to Greece's internal affairs taken by Lee Farmer and by Andrews. During the Colonel's dictatorship, Lee Farmer took no stance either for or against, and this led to some bitter quarrels with Andrews, especially after Andrews arrived at the Lee Farmer villa in Kadamili to recover from the wounds he had received in the street fighting in 1973. In darker moments, Andrews felt that Lee Farmer was a sellout, but he was also grateful to the older writer for penning generous reviews and helping to keep his books in print. On this spectrum, between the apolitical and the politically engaged, Craxton probably came somewhere in the middle. He was intensely involved in conservation causes in his native Chania, and that stance must have made him many adversaries. During the dictatorship, the colonel somehow saved him from a dilemma by expelling him, seeing him as a security risk. So where in the end do these creative figures ultimately belong? Lee Farmer was genuinely torn between England and Greece. Verdant English landscapes sometimes made him pine for stony Greek ones. But in later life, there were also times when he yearned to be closer to the social and literary elite of his homeland, where his talent was enormously appreciated. And his writing never fails to reflect a keen sense of the fads, curiosities, and comfort levels of England's chattering classes. By the time of his death, Liephomer's obsession was simply to be buried alongside Joan. It wouldn't have mattered where. He was duly interred in her native Worcestershire. His tombstone includes a Greek inscription from Cavafy saying he was that most excellent of things, a Greek. But it's not in a foreign field, it's in the heart of England. Craxton was forced by illness to return to England, where he died pining for Crete. As for Andrews, it would have been extraordinary if he had died anywhere except Greece, and indeed, he died a rather mysterious death, drowning in the turbulent waters off the island of Kythera. Liephomer wrote an admiring and affectionate obituary. For all his radicalism, Andrews was certainly at one with Liephomer, and in a different way, Craxton, in not wanting the traditional aspects of Greece's environment and way of life to change very much. All three were appalled by the prospect of mass tourism or top-down modernization, which in their view would ruin everything that was distinctive about Greece, from the shepherds reciting epic poetry to the elaborate baptismal ceremonies in which they had participated as godparents. In short, they loved the pre-modern features of Greece. So how do things stand now, 70 years after Andrews and Craxton started their lives in Greece, 30 years after Andrews's death? Well, what made travel writing possible in those days was the fact that Greece was a very, very different place from Britain or the United States, despite the existence of a handful of sophisticated interpreters who could act as go-betweens. These days, the difference is less evident, and the need for go-betweens is also less evident as more and more people lead transnational lives. If you went to one of the villages where Liephomer hobnobbed with nomad shepherds, these days you'd probably find that they were watching CNN and having Zoom calls with cousins who were studying in London or doing jobs in Berlin. It would be hard these days to pull off, in Greece anyway, the literary trick that was so well employed by the 20th century writers, in which the narrator seems to be moving randomly through a very exotic terrain which he, it's usually a he, somehow understands thanks to the narrator's powers of observation and his body of pre-existing knowledge. That would be harder now because the terrain seems less exotic and the skill needed to decipher it isn't quite so great. Nonetheless, plenty of excellent writing about Greece, the Greek world, Greek society, does still flow from the pen of Anglophone writers. So I had the idea of asking three writers who are recognized in that field, first of all, whether they thought that travel writing in any sense about Greece was still possible, and whether they felt commonality of any kind with the literary travelers of the mid-20th century, or whether, on the contrary, they were very conscious of the difference. The three people I asked were Alicia Stallings, the poet, Sofka Zinoviev, who is both a novelist, biographer, and memoirist, and Sarah Wheeler, who's a very accomplished travel writer in many parts of the world, most of them much more remote from her native Britain than Greece would be, but nonetheless a person who cut her teeth, so to speak, when writing about Greece.
Thank you for your patience in watching the video. Now, I set up the prospect of some interesting answers from those three writers, and indeed all three gave me answers which were striking and in some ways counterintuitive. And in the order I introduced them. Now, what Alicia Stallings had to say is that even for her, living long-term in Greece, married to a Greek husband, she is still struck by the differentness of the place. She still finds it irreducibly different from her homeland. And to quote her own words, even today, Greece does not lack the quality of there. On the contrary, there is a lot of there-ness. For the Westerner, the basic break between the Latin and Greek alphabet, also the music coming out of the taxi cabs and cafes, which carry the scales and modes of Asia Minor, the taxi driver who crosses himself, the call of the pagliagis as he drives his three-wheeled vehicle through the neighborhood, then the summer clack of the backgammon coming from the neighbor's balcony, a society much more attuned to the seasons than most people are in America or Britain, a place where you eat things when they are ripe and don't expect to see everything at the supermarket. I like being aware of when wildflowers are blooming, irises first, then poppies. I like the fact that twice a year, the farmer's market moves from one street to another. That's another big indicator of the seasons. And I love the summer outdoor cinemas. So for her, as a highly sophisticated observer of Greece and a frequent traveler, I suppose, between Greece and her native America, she nonetheless is reassuringly convinced that despite globalization, despite homogenization, Greece remains an irreducibly different and in some ways sort of interestingly intractable place. That was Alicia's answer. Alicia, by the way, is a very accomplished poet. She's written very arresting poetry about modern Greek reality, also fused in her knowledge of the classics. And she's a translator of Hesiod, perhaps the most ancient of the Greek prose writers we have. So there are many strings to her bow. Now, with Sofka Zinoviev, she's another person who has settled in Greece, happens to be married to a Greek husband, and in contrast with the mid-20th century writers who had to, in some ways, present the account of Greece as a travelogue, even if they actually lived in Greece all the time. I think writers like Alicia and Sofka embrace the fact that they live long-term in Greece. They don't feel obliged to pretend to be travelers. And this is what Sofka wrote to me. My Russian great-uncle Kirill said you can write a book about a new place when you've been there for 5 days or else for 5 years. The first is when everything is new and exotic. And you find plenty of examples of this in the great literary beasts of yesteryear who traveled high and low and conquered Greece with their pens. I do bow down before these marvelous writers, but I find the second variety, the long-term residents, more interesting. People for whom depth takes priority over breadth. Going deeper in one place sits easier in an overheated, overcrowded world where travel is cheap and easy. This allows for voices that might once have been unheard. Refugees, women who work, women who have children in the new places. My own so-called travel writing overlaps with memoir and anthropology, and it's more like traveling in my own life, which happens to have rooted itself in Greece. So that's Sofka's answer, and a very good one, I must say. Now, what about Sarah Wheeler? Now, I found her answer was succinct, but in some ways very surprising and thought-provoking. So what Sarah Wheeler has to say, now Sarah is a writer about not only Greece, but Antarctica, Chile, Russia, many places much more remote in a sense than Greece. But what Sarah has to say is this: I do feel affinity with almost everybody who has written about Greece. I'm a Hellenist, and I believe in a certain Greekness that survived the Turkish occupation and will also survive the European Union. But the whole point of travel writing, to my mind, is to find the universal in the particular. Now, it may be true that the world of Kevin Andrews, living in the Athens district of Metz in the 60s, is very remote. But still, he touches on things that are much deeper than any concerns specific to that era. Universals outlive specific time periods, as Andrews knew very well. And anyway, the whole world changes, not just Greece. So in other words, Sarah's point is that, yes, I mean, the world of the mid-20th century writers has passed, and they talk about things that are very remote from the reality of the year 2023. But actually, that doesn't matter, because if their writing's any good at all, it's because in their descriptions of the particular, they also somehow evoke universal themes, and that's why we still read them. It's not the details of what life was like in 1940 or 1950. it's because somewhere in those details, universal themes are touched, and therefore they do touch us in 2023, and they'll always touch us. So that's an entirely unexpected line from Sarah, and I appreciate it very much. So thank you to those three ladies for giving me such honest and thought-provoking answers to my questions. I think it's high time for me to answer a few of your questions, if you have any.
If I can ask the participants to start putting questions in the chat, you have to press the chat button and place your questions there, and we'll try to answer them as well we can. Vasily, do you have some thoughts as a starter, yeast, for the discussion?
I do not, but as I'm trying to listen to all of this, including the answers of these three outstanding people, I'm trying to distinguish between traveling, traveloguing, and experiencing, which really takes me into successive layers of depth. And I'm wondering where do we go from one level to another? Is this to go back to Zinoviev about time only, or also about something else? It strikes me that Zinoviev has a Russian background, yet her answer was probably the least differentiated of the three, although the other two were Anglo-Saxons per se.
Yes, indeed. Yes. No, but shall I say something in reply?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just provoking you.
Exactly.
I didn't have a little mini speech.
Indeed,
just through a provocation.
That's right. No, it's true that Sofka has a very, she grew up in England, of course, but one side of her family was Russian. And so she brings a whole mixture of sensibilities to her engagement with Greece. But I mean, I think we can agree that we like the fact that she embraces long-term residence in Greece, as opposed to the mid-20th century writers who felt sometimes obliged to write in travel writing mode, even though they were in fact long-time residents of Greece. They had to present yes, whereas in Sofka's it's traveling through life as opposed to traveling through particular locales. I mean, one interesting thing about Sofka's work is that she wrote a novel about contemporary Greece, but it did reflect sort of contemporary reality, and it was in some respects, not others. There were aspects of memoir and autobiography. The narrator of this novel was an English woman who had married a Greek journalist, but it also, in a rather clever way, took you back to the mid-20th century and to the time of the Civil War. And actually, the novel featured a story of two sisters who'd been separated by the Civil War. One had gone to Moscow, one had stayed in Athens, and how they reconnected, and how they understood certain events from the 1940s in a whole new light at the end of their lives. So, in a sense, the fascination of those sort of Second World War events and post-Second World War events, they pop up even in a contemporary novel as well.
Costin, may I ask a second question? Just the privilege here.
For sure, the chairman can do anything he wants. But I do
just to throw another kind of prompt at Bruce. For the sake of also provoking some more, is it that the fascination of Willer with Greece and all this that she describes is actually the other side of Greece, which is the Eastern, the Oriental? As a society with on numerous occasions taking on the dual nature of Greekness and Hellenism. Some of us want to think of Asia Minor as the second lung of Greece breathing with two lungs, one on the Occident, the other on the Orient, and Aegean being the as we physicians call the trachea, the one that connects the two. But is it the one that both is more difficult to understand, but at the same time, totally fascinating to them. The bouzouki sound, the tavli sound,
Yeah, exactly.
the smells, the
Yes,
sounds, and
yes,
something
yes,
yet not as auditory, but it's really something in the atmosphere that's actually somewhat more exotic and mystical.
Well, of course, one of the most famous passages in Lymphoma is a section of the book Rumeli, where he reflects on what he calls the Hellenic Romaic dilemma. He suggested there is a kind of internal conflict in Greek society, and indeed sort of within the heads of many Greek people, between the rationalism of the Hellenic world and the kind of impulsive emotionalism of the Romios, of the Oriental, the Anatolites. But he introduced it in a very touching way. He describes himself sort of being of all things, in a bar in Panama, and he realizes that the people serving him in this bar are Greeks, and he addresses them in Greek, and to which the barman replies, "Romios diste," using the old-fashioned word "Romios," and this immediately, and he senses the homesickness of the barman, and shares it in a way, and that leads him into this sort of long piece of speculation with lists of characteristics which are typical of the Hellene and the Romios, but he also observes that it's quite that for him to use the word as a foreigner, to use the word Romios to describe a Greek is actually misunderstood. It doesn't go down well, because it's as one of his Greek friends said, Romiosini, it's our unwashed linen, it's taplitamas, it's our unwashed laundry, and it's a self that we don't want to show to the world, and so it's better that you as a foreigner don't use the word Romios. We prefer to use the word Elinas, but nonetheless, I think it stands the test of time quite well. I think he's onto something. It's oversimplified, it's stereotyped, it's essentialized. But nonetheless, I think he has caught something in the Hellenic Romaic dilemma, and I think it bears reading and rereading. And it's part of the subtext, by the way, is that his own temperament is that of the Romios, and sort of as a kind of as a mountain fighter in Crete, he wasn't Hellene, he was the Romios. He has a soft spot for the Romios side of things.
Yeah, but the term in Greek, among Greeks, in fact, it's deeply felt, and I would say endearing. I'm not sure if I would like to hear it from others, but between Greeks, it sounds wonderful.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I'm done.
Do we have any questions in the chat so far?
We don't. Miss Martha Kirillidou has been sharing some information, on the Greeks in Panama and the Greek community. They are about, Sarah Wheeler and other references from Bruce's presentation.
There's only one. There's also one from Costa. Costa to everyone. There's two actually. I can see here.
And I do see from Costa.
Yes.
I do not see it. Do you mind reading it to us?
Yes. Thank you for this insightful lecture, Mr. Clark. Have you thought about writing a book about British Philhellenism? There you go. It's a proposal for a book, Bruce.
Well, gosh, thank you. Now, well, I tell you what, if I did, I wouldn't want to make it only about the British and Hellenism. I would, because there's, I think I would want to broaden it to English language writing about Greece, because that includes not only British and American, but there are a number of other significant categories. There is, especially in the 20th century, Irish writing about Greece, and indeed the interest of several Irish poets, including the Nobel Prize winner Seamus Heaney in Greece. He wrote some wonderful sonnets from Hellas, describing his trip around the Peloponnese, in the course of which he heard about his Nobel Prize, and reacting to the antiquities of Sparta and Pylos and Mycenae, So if I were ever to write a book about Anglophone writing on Greece, I'd certainly want to include Irish writing on Greece, also perhaps Australian writing on Greece as well, and then the particulars, and then Greek Australian writing on Greece as well. There's a whole category of literature, by Greek Australians whose natural language is English, but who come to Greece with sort of both detachment and very intimate knowledge as well. So that's also very much part of the story. And then there is a category which is of maybe including some people listening to this lecture, for all I know, of category of people born in Greece who then migrate and adopt English as their preferred language of writing. I mean, for example, Panos Karnesis is a Greek-born writer who lives in England. He's written some excellent fiction, novels, short stories, and a very striking novel set in the final days of the Asia Minor campaign. And he happens to have chosen to write in English, and then he translates his own work into Greek. So he does his own translation, but nonetheless, English is the first language he writes in, and he's an absolute master of the English language, although it's his second language, and so that's an important category. So if I were to write about English language writing on Greece, it would go much further than just Britain.
Bruce, we have a question from Peter from the Greek side of things.
Oh, please, yeah.
He asked us, what are the Greeks' reaction to these writers and more contemporary ones? Do they see writers who see Greece from a foreign perspective as contributing something important or as getting it all wrong?
Good question. Well, that's, yes, it's a very good test in a way of a book written in Greek, a book written in English about Greece, whether it and how well it translates, and how now in the case of Lee Farmer, his translator, especially in particular of the book Mani, was the former Prime Minister Tzannis Tzannetakis, who became a close friend. And actually was spent part of the Colonel's period in internal exile, and used that to translate Lee Farmer's book Mani, and clearly there was a great meeting of minds between the two of them, and I think that as far as I can judge, Lee Farmer's book on Mani actually reads very well when rendered by Tzannetakis, and it's entered the canon of literature about Greece that that Greek speakers can consume and enjoy. My guess is that Durrell to Greek readers charms in a way with his ability to evoke landscape and mythology, but would also seem perhaps a bit sort of patronizing and orientalist at times. And certainly his book about Cyprus, Bitter Lemons, has been described as beautiful but patronizing, and I think that many native Greek speakers might have that reaction. It's interesting, how a Greek speaker would react to Henry Miller, because and there's something sort of utterly sort of outrageous about Henry Miller's writing, but it's so outrageous it's refreshing. And so you have him sort of going around the Peloponnese, Crete, in the company of these august intellectuals, but nonetheless, engaging with local people. There's a scene in which he's in Heraklion, and he's introduced to a room full of kind of the local Heraklion intellectuals, and he's obliged to speak to them in French, which he masters fortunately. And sometimes he enjoys these interactions, and sometimes he finds them absurd or unproductive. But nonetheless, there is a kind of a glorious self-confidence about him, about his judgments. He will describe landscapes as thrilling or dull or nothing in between anyway. And it's on the basis of having been there for 1 day or 3 days or whatever. So he's outrageously self-confident in the way he judges people and places and things. And yet I think that some people would find it quite endearing. There's actually the the impulsiveness with which he comes to conclusions about people and places and scenes and what they mean is something that sort of I think some Greeks could relate to. It's a Achiapoplesy. He has a view about everything. and so that's yes. I mean,
yeah, that's
an idea. That's an idea of sort of how these writers.
I'm dying to ask a quick question. In the 80s, I took my children up to the mountains in Greece and about, and they began to spy antennas, TV antennas. And so, this, TV in the Greek villages, this destroys the feeling kind of Greekdom. It's as if though they were looking for Sophia Loren to walk about.
Yes.
So what's your view in terms of heritage? Do we try to preserve kind of in a crystal ball or inside a laboratory environment, the Greece of the Tavli being
yes.
Or how do we allow the little Yayula to watch her TV because she likes TV? Even though we have this impression of a little lady in black knitting and gossiping and doing things, she likes TV. So who am I to say, no, you should go back to my image of Greek?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit, should I relax? Should I feel okay? Or am I in trouble?
Well, I mean, I will describe this in very specific terms. I mean, I've for the last 30 years, I've been going back quite often to this little seaside town of Limne in Evia. And I remember what it was like in the mid 80s. And I have some idea what it's like now. And so I can make a comparison. And I remember when sort of, television became popular, people said, well, this will destroy local culture. It'll destroy tradition. It'll destroy the art of conversation. And, I think that there was some merit in those comments. But at the same time, I mean, that in quite a spontaneous way, I would say that, traditional dancing clubs are very, very, flourishing in Limni still, and it's a very popular hobby, to take part in Greek dancing, not just sort of 1 or 2 days a year, but really sort of through the year. I mean, they're learning different dances and from different parts of the Greek world, and then performing on certain occasions. That's a very popular hobby, and it's nothing forced about it. It's just something that sort of emerges fairly spontaneously, just something people like to do. And there are, what I see is a town that is in some ways quite comfortable with itself, and which is aware of tradition, is aware of what needs to be changed and what needs to be celebrated. And sometimes it's best to let these processes evolve spontaneously.
Vasiliou, I think we're nearing the end of our
I have one more question, actually. Again, I want to go back to the idea of Westerners partaking on the eastern side of things in Greece. If you would like to really touch upon this a little bit, because this is the least well understood, and I think it's probably by far the most challenging. And there's one thing to look at it as, if you wish, a local color, couleur locale, or curiosity, and a very different thing to, in a way, become part of it, at least to some extent. What do we know, and what do you think about Westerners coming into this side of Greekness in Greece, for example? I mean, let's take Greece, because I know there were John Taberner and so on who worked elsewhere and somehow, came close to that. But...
Well, you remember what Henry Miller said about, the approach to God. Sometimes you approach, sometimes you converge, I mean, there's a whole category of writing which I could have mentioned, which is social anthropology in Greece, beginning in the 50s, in a sense, if you were looking for a kind of pre-modern rural society or even sort of urban society to study in Europe, Greece actually offered itself. It wasn't behind the Iron Curtain. It was easy to visit. And so there was quite a flourishing of social anthropology in Greece in the Second World War. There was books like Vasilika by Ernestine Friedel, and then there was another classic work by Juliet Duboulé, Portrait of a Greek Mountain Village, reflecting research in a village in Evia in the sort of mid-60s. And then that was followed by a very interesting piece of research in an urban setting by René Hirschon in the district of Coquigny in Paris, among Asia Minor refugees, and demonstrating that, and which had demonstrating that the refugees 50 years after the Asia Minor catastrophe, the refugees still used that word of themselves, and they were still, although relatively poor, they actually thought of themselves as superior in some respects, as bearers of a superior sort of social capital in relation to the native Greeks. And also, as René pointed out, as very sophisticated exponents of their own religion. I mean, they could explain not only the feasts and customs of the church, but what they meant theologically.
They were Byzantines, you see.
They're Byzantines, yes, exactly. They're Byzantines, and yes, and they were able to explain, why we remember the dead in certain ways. We do certain things on Good Friday, Easter, and so on. And so, and that was, well, now I was going to say on a personal note that both Juliet Duboulé and René, in fact, converted to Orthodox Christianity as a result of that, which didn't, without, in a sense, compromising the academic credentials, but nonetheless, they did, in a certain manner of speaking, merge with the subject matter, albeit at a slightly different level.
Thank you.
Great. I think it's time to give a real big thanks to Bruce for preparing such a tremendous.
Kosti, we have one more question there by John Jastrow.
Just now.
Yeah.
I can read it if you'd like.
Please.
Mr. Jastrow says, I've lived in Greece for 6 years, first in Athens and then in Thessaloniki in the 80s. It took 2 years to get over the tourist mentality, and then real life took over. I've been back a few times since then, most recently in 2019, and I still consider it my second home. Yeah, it's more of a comment. Yeah, okay. Contribution, and thank you so much for your kind comment. I would like personally to thank Bruce as the new operations manager of SPGH. Thank you so much for the smooth collaboration and for the excellent presentation. Of course, I would like to thank Dr. Koliatsos and Dr. Toregas for organizing the event and all the participants. Before we close, I just want to let you know that I'm sharing in the chat a link for our membership. If you would like to become members of our society, we would be grateful.
Elizabeth, I think Kostis needs to have the final word.
Absolutely, yes.
Can't you see?
No. I think we heard the sermon too many times. This has been a wonderful event for me. I learned so much, Bruce. Thanks that you exist, that you're able to integrate so many things that are difficult for an individual to all bring together, and it comes so effortlessly from you. You're a true gift for us Greeks, whether we're part of the diaspora or we're in Greece itself, and we need those kinds of insights more and more. So I hope you take up the challenge, do a few more books.
Indeed, thank you. Well, thank you.
Your current books are fantastic, so I can imagine what the next one would be. So thanks very much. As a member of the board of SPGH, we take heritage seriously, and I think we've had a great discussion about heritage. So
well, thank you so much. Yes, I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, and I've been forced to think about things for the first time in some cases, and it's been a very useful addition to my thought processes. So thank you all very much indeed.
Very good.